I would not be standing here today if it were not for the fact that from the moment of my arrest in black communities all over the country, there were spontaneous displays of support and solidarity. This movement spread throughout this country, abroad, and became a tremendous example of what international solidarity is all about. And it is only because of that movement, it is only because of masses of people standing together, struggling, that I am free today.
The following is a speech of Angela Davis, recorded at the University of Houston on Monday, April 2nd, 1973. The speech was a part of the World Issues Conference sponsored by the University of Houston Student Association and the University of Houston Program Council. The World Council of the University of Houston is a student organization formed in 1968 to develop international affairs programming of significance at the university. The University of Houston World Issues Conference convenes annually, inviting student and faculty participation from the United States, Latin America, and Canada.
We're going to talk a little bit about revolution this evening. The topic of this conference, the conference sponsored by the World Council, is Age of Revolution, Agenda for the World. And in fact, I'm very pleased that this conference is being approached with a little more seriousness than in past years. Such a conference would have been approached perhaps with a little less bias. Because I remember when people used to consider Rockefeller as the expert on revolution in Latin America. I guess some people still consider that the CIA is the expert on global revolution in Africa, Asia, and then of course in Chile. As a black woman, as a communist, and as a revolutionary, it gives me great pleasure to speak to you this evening about the state of the world revolution. And whether we agree with it or not, that revolution is on the agenda. The face of the globe is being rapidly transformed into an arena of a fierce battle between the oppressed and the oppressor. And what is perhaps so striking about this moment is that we are successfully challenging and often defeating the most powerful and the most menacing enemy of humanity. I'm speaking about the United States government. The United States government, which is the protector and the accomplice of the U.S. capitalist class. But this government is meeting with ever more isolation and is being rapidly forced into retreat. Not very long ago, some months ago, in fact in December, I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes very convincing evidence of the weakening international position of the government of this country. On December 4th, 1972, I attended a session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And on that day, the socialist president of Chile, Dr. Salvador Allende, addressed the assembly. Allende delivered a scathing attack on the U.S. government and on the monopolies which it serves. This is an example of what he was saying on that day. Before the conscience of the world, he said, I accuse IT&T of attempting to bring about civil war in my country. That is what we call imperialist action. And of course now we know that Allende was speaking the truth, because we've been reading about those IT&T executives who have been forced to reveal to us the plot which they and the CIA hatched in order to prevent Allende and his popular unity government from acceding to the presidency after the people's victory in the elections of 1972. After Allende analyzed in detail how U.S. capitalist interests had systematically robbed his country of their natural resources and were continuing to do their dirty work by fomenting revolution, he made it clear that he was not only talking about his own country, he was not only speaking for Chile, nor only of Latin America, but he was speaking on behalf of people throughout the world oppressed by U.S. imperialism. He was speaking on behalf of Africans and Asians and Latin Americans. He spoke very forcefully. And at the end of his speech, he spoke very passionately about the inevitability of the ultimate triumph of socialism in the world. It was a very impressive speech. But even more impressive was the reaction to that speech. At the end of the speech, those of us who were sitting up in the observers' gallery stood up and applauded and shouted, "Viva Chile, viva Allende." But a few moments later, some of the delegates on the floor started to stand up. And then finally, the entire floor, virtually the entire floor of the UN General Assembly had bursted into roaring applause. They were all giving Allende a standing ovation. A man by the name of George Bush looked very weak on that day. He looked very pained, sitting in his corner seat on the back row. But he, too, as he looked around him and saw everyone announcing their assent to the revolution which is encompassing the world, he started to clap a little bit. And then finally he stood up too. I guess he was looking around to see if anybody was watching him, and he was clapping a little bit. It was ironic because you know who George Bush is. He was exceedingly shocked on that day. He was exceedingly shocked because I'm sure the only people whom he saw on his side, the only delegates, were a couple of rows down, the delegate from South Africa. He wasn't clapping. The delegate from Portugal, he was a stranger in the United Nations which was originally formed as an instrument of U.S. imperialism. But that event inside the United Nations, I think, was a microcosm of what is happening in the world, a microcosm of the isolation of U.S. ruling circles throughout the globe, and a very telling preview of what is in store for U.S. imperialism in the future, in the very near future. Some weeks before Allende visited the UN, the General Assembly listened to another address. Listened to the address of Amilcar Cabral, who was then the leader of the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau. He appealed to the UN for support of their armed struggle in Africa against the Portuguese government. And you may not believe it, but as a result of his appeal, the UN voted not only to recognize Amilcar Cabral's party as the only legitimate representative of the people whom the Portuguese pretend to rule, but they voiced their support, they voted their support for armed struggle against the Portuguese. This is a resolution which passed on the floor of the UN. You know who voted against that resolution? France, a former colonialist power. Britain, a former colonialist power. Portugal, South Africa, and one more country. I don't even have to tell you what the name of that country is. A few months ago, Amilcar Cabral was ruthlessly assassinated by agents of Portuguese colonialism because he and his movement were becoming far too dangerous, far too great a threat to Portuguese colonialism and to the imperialist hold over Africa in general. And of course, the death of Cabral was a very serious setback for the national liberation movements. In the first place, for the movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, but also for the national liberation movements throughout Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Zimbabwe, and throughout the continent where there continues to be colonialist domination. Yet, those of us who are involved in the global battle against imperialism know that such setbacks are only temporary. They are not permanent defeats because they cannot halt the tide of resistance. The liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau continues to rage on and will ultimately defeat Portuguese colonialism. Like the coup d'etat in Ghana when Nkrumah was deposed, like the terrible slaughter of the thousands of revolutionaries in Indonesia, the assassination of Cabral can only be a temporary defeat. And I think that any of you who would sit down and seriously study the international scene would see that today the trend of history is very clear. What happened on that day, on December 4th in the United Nations? What happened when the resolution in support of armed struggle against colonialism was passed, was a mirror of the forces of history. There is no doubt about the fact that history has already sided with the forces of revolution, the forces of national liberation, the forces of socialism. And through the protests and battles of millions abroad and in this country as well, history has indicted imperialism. History has indicted U.S. imperialism and has already condemned it to its grave. The job of progressives and revolutionaries everywhere is to hasten the death of imperialism. To hasten the death of imperialism by building the kinds of massive movements that can force imperialism into retreat. And when we talk about the fact that history is sided with the forces of revolution against the forces of imperialism, we're talking about some very real developments, some very concrete things which we can see all around us. We're talking about some very real developments in the world, developments which black people and brown people and Asians and Indians should be able to relate to and should feel very, very close to. In 1962, the United States government, under the sponsorship of John F. Kennedy, organized an invasion of the free territory of Cuba, organized an invasion of counter-revolutionaries to overthrow the government which the Cuban people had decided upon, to challenge their sovereignty and to re-establish the tyranny. You remember the Bay of Pigs. At that time, the Cubans declared their revolution a socialist revolution. In fact, it was just on the very same day that the vanguard came in and bombed a number of Cuban sisters and bombed the offices where a number of Cuban sisters and brothers were working and killed them. At the funeral, the people of Cuba decided that their revolution had to move in the direction of socialism. And on the occasion of the funeral, they committed themselves to defend their socialist country from the assaults of the U.S. government, as represented by the counter-revolutionaries who had invaded at the Bay of Pigs. They fought courageously, and they won. They won. This victory was extremely important. It was very important for all of us, because this was the first time in the history of the United States that it had been defeated in the territory of the Americas. This was the first defeat of U.S. imperialism right here, 90 miles away. And the Bay of Pigs, the victory at the Bay of Pigs, continues to be the most striking kind of evidence of the diminishing ability of U.S. imperialism to do its dirty work without serious challenges, without resistance. Today, imperialism has to expect challenges and resistance wherever it attempts to exploit, oppress, and extract its millions of dollars of profit from the labor of our sisters and brothers abroad. It can no longer do this with impunity. It often has to go in with tanks. And it always goes in with the CIA and other such agencies. U.S. imperialism is on the decline. The forces of socialism are on the ascent. There is a tremendous difference between the way the world looks today and the way it looked just 20 years ago. 20 years is not a very long time. But let's look back towards the 50s and try to see if we can't get a sense of the kind of world situation we're living in, of the revolutionary era we're living in, by comparing it to what happened during the 1950s. In the 1950s, the U.S. government declared war on an Asian country where the people were struggling for national liberation in much the same way that it declared war on Vietnam and Indochina today. This was the war against the national liberation forces in Korea. But you see, then the United States government was able not only to win the support of the United Nations in this war, but it fought the liberation forces in Korea under the name of the United Nations. And there was no mass resistance at all to that war. 20 years ago, the Soviet Union and the newly formed revolutionary governments in Eastern Europe were just recovering from the devastation inflicted upon their countries by the German fascists. The People's Republic of China had just begun to embark upon its revolutionary course. And the national liberation fighters in Africa were just beginning to build their collective thrust for freedom. And right here at home, racists were running rampant in the South and throughout the country. Our sisters and brothers were being lynched, and no one was speaking out. Communists were being pursued by McCarthy's goons, and people in this country were not speaking out in any kind of collective, forceful way. Today, 20 years later, much of this has changed. The socialist community of nations, especially the Soviet Union, has consolidated its economy and is making enormous social and cultural advances. The United Nations is refusing to be an instrument of the economic and political desires and interests of the U.S. government. And most of the African countries have won political independence from direct colonial rule. Those still under colonial domination are fighting very fierce battles for their freedom. And right here at home, the Black liberation movement has ascended to new levels of consciousness. Our people are demanding fundamental revolutionary change. And as Malcolm said some years ago, we have decided that we do not want to become a part of a boat that is doomed to sink into the ocean. And if we compare the reaction to the war in Vietnam, to the reaction to the war against the people of Korea. We've seen an unprecedented mass movement speak out in opposition to the genocide against the people of Vietnam. And in fact, when the peace agreement was signed, that victory, in the words of Le Duc Tho, was not only a victory for the people of Vietnam, but it was a victory for oppressed people throughout the world, and especially a victory for those of us in this country. It was indeed a victory because it forced U.S. imperialism further into retreat. It forced the U.S. government to recognize the sovereignty and respect the national independence and the unity of Vietnam. But like the Vietnamese, we can't be self-content with that victory. We have to be careful, and we have to protect it from further assaults by the U.S. government. Because you see, Nixon is like a wounded animal. Even though he knows that he has already lost the war, he will not give up. And he is still talking about resuming the bombing against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So we must be vigilant, and we must continue the pressure. We have to safeguard that victory, because that victory foreshadows for us the ultimate defeat of our enemy, the ultimate success of the rising revolutionary forces in the world. And that victory is so important because look at Vietnam, a tiny country in Asia, an underdeveloped country, an agricultural country, which has been continually invaded for decades and decades by imperialist incursions from abroad. And look at the United States of America. Look at the complicated, sophisticated, monstrous weapons they have been able to deliver, even more striking assaults on their enemy, because they have before them the example of the victory of the people of Vietnam. They have before them the knowledge, the real knowledge, that U.S. imperialism is not invulnerable. It can be defeated, and it is in fact growing weaker and weaker. And there shouldn't be any doubt in our minds about the infirmities of U.S. imperialism. We've been reading recently about the dollar crisis. And apparently the dollar crisis is so bad that a couple of weeks ago, this was something I read in the paper not very long ago, a thief got caught stealing some money. And the police asked him why it was he didn't steal the dollars. He said, they weren't worth anything anyway. But that is indeed an example of the weakening position of the U.S. government abroad. But you see, precisely because this government, this monopoly capitalist system has suffered so many setbacks, so many defeats abroad. The giant corporations are beginning to escalate their exploitation of those of us who are living right here within the belly of the beast, within the entrails of the monster, as Jose Marti, the apostle of the Cuban Revolution, once said. There is this new economic policy. There are the cutbacks. There is in every single aspect of the Nixon domestic policy an edge of racism. And I submit to you that the most important problem confronting the people within this country today is the problem of racism. And you see, it's important for white people to recognize the way in which they themselves are affected by racism. Because if you noticed what Nixon was doing during his campaign, and if you notice what he's doing now, he is trying to create his new silent majority. The silent majority was a couple of years ago. He doesn't want a silent majority now. He wants a very loud, very racist, very openly racist majority today. And he is using racism to attempt to conquer the masses of white people in this country. When he talks about cutting back the child care centers, welfare, OEO, and all of these programs, that is a racist edge. And you see, what is happening is that what used to be a very, very flimsy war against poverty in this country is becoming a full-scale, brutal war against the poor, and especially against And this war is directed in the first place against black people, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Asians, and Indians. Just look at what is happening. Federal funds are being pulled out of all of these social services because to invest money for the education of a black child is simply not profitable to the corporations. And as they meet with ever more defeats abroad, they are forced to try to recoup their profits right here at home. When they are thrown out of countries in Africa, when they're thrown out of Tanzania, when copper is nationalized in Zambia, and they're thrown out of Zambia, when IT&T is thrown out of Chile, then they come right back here and try to shove the burden of their defeats on our shoulders. Why do you think all these prices are so high? Why do you think there's so much of a trend towards speed up in the factories. And some of the auto plants in Detroit, the situation for workers, and especially black workers, is so incredible, so inhuman. Often the assembly line will be moving so fast that the workers have to run to catch up with it. Can you imagine doing that 8 hours a day? But you see what they are doing, and there's documented evidence to prove that, I think it's in the Chrysler plant in Detroit. What they have been doing is that when white workers retire, they will hire one black worker to do the work of 2 white workers who retire. And just recently they hired quite a few Arab workers. And the Arab workers they are forcing to do the work of 2 black workers. That means the work of 4 white workers. You should just take a look at the profits that a corporation like General Motors has been able to... See, they're supposed to be in a state of crisis, right? They're supposed to be having all kinds of problems with their profits, but General Motors made more profits this year than ever before. They produced more cars, but they laid off thousands of workers. See, something is wrong there. While this war on workers and on the poor continues, the government of this country resorts to repression and to other means in order to prevent the emergence of a united revolutionary movement. And you see, racism can be very effective. Because if we're talking about socialist revolution, we're talking about overthrowing the capitalist system, expropriating all the means of production, taking over all of the plants, all of the factories, all of the corporations, all of the firms, and running them ourselves, and using the products that are produced for our own needs and to satisfy our own desires, not the desires of a Rockefeller or a Hughes or a DuPont or I could go on and on and on. But you see, what happens is that Nixon tries to convince the white worker that the reason why he's having problems, he or she's having problems, is because there's a black worker who's trying to get his job. You've heard about the Philadelphia plan, construction industry, and you know what they did in terms of trying to flare up, provoke the most incredible kind of racist hysteria among the construction workers, because they think that white workers aren't going to be able to get jobs because there's a certain job priority list. There have to be so many black workers and so many minority workers. But it's very effective, this use of racism, to divide. Because when you divide, you conquer. And when you can provoke this kind of racism in the ordinary white worker, then his mind is so confused, he is so disoriented, that he is convinced that the boss, the capitalist, the exploiter, the oppressor is his friend, and the black worker is his enemy. And so he fights against us. You know, there can be no revolution on the agenda as long as that kind of division continues to take place. And it's precisely at this moment that we need a united revolutionary movement, because only revolutionary change can solve the problems that are facing us today. And everybody knows that there are problems. All you have to do right now is to go into a supermarket and listen to all the grumbling. Look at the meat boycott. I mean, can you imagine what could occur if a movement like the meat boycott could be marshaled to begin to deal with racism? See, all you have to do is go into the factory and talk to workers about speed up. All you have to do is talk to parents about the schools, the deteriorated conditions of the schools to which they must send their children. All you have to do is talk to them about the elimination of child care centers. All you have to do is talk to prisoners. Talk to a Rochelle McGee about what it's like to be in San Quentin prison. All you have to do is talk to a black sister or brother, Chicano or Puerto Rican sister or brother, and you'll find out that there is a terrible racist crisis inside the judicial system in this country. All you have to do is talk to some Indian sisters and brothers who've been inside Wounded Knee and who have had tanks pointed at them. And you will know that there is something terribly wrong with this country. I thought I was in Vietnam when I went to Wounded Knee. And as we reflect upon all of this, we must remember that racism is the most serious obstacle to the development of a united revolutionary movement. And racism will continue to be. Racism is very dangerous because racism can contain the seeds of fascism. Racism can be used in the very same way that anti-Semitism was used in Nazi Germany. But you see, there's a difference. Because anti-Semitism was not ingrained in the history of Germany. It was something that had to be created. It had to be inflicted upon the people. But racism is something which is so much a part of the fabric of this society, so much a part of the history of the United States of America from its very inception up to the moment. That the threat of fascism can be even more dangerous, even more severe. And we have to talk about conquering on whatever levels we can this racism, because we need unity. We have to talk about a movement that embraces workers of all colors. And white workers have to recognize that they can be led by black workers and Chicano workers, and Puerto Rican workers and Indian workers. the first prerequisite of this unity is an ever more intense fight against racism. And you see, white people cannot wait for us as black people and as other people of color to lead that fight. White people have to begin to take the initiative and militantly challenge racism wherever they see it cropping up, whether it is in its institutional form or whether in the form of an attitude or a casual remark dropped by one of their friends or colleagues. Only thus, sisters and brothers, can we talk about laying the groundwork for a united revolutionary movement. And I submit that in building this revolutionary movement, we have to join the millions throughout the world who have already successfully fought for the triumph of socialism. We have to join the millions who are still locked in the class struggle, determined that the rest of the world join the 1/3 of the world's population that already lives under socialism. With the triumph of the first socialist revolution in 1917, the Russian Revolution under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, a new historical era was ushered into being. A new historical era for all people. And you see, one of the ways in which the government of this country likes to play with our minds by trying to convince us that the Soviet Union is a white country, is an all-white country. There are 100 different nationalities living within the Soviet Union. There are republics within the Soviet Union almost entirely constituted by people of color, led by people of color, Asian people. Central Asia includes the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Republic of Tajikistan, Kyrgyz, Kazakhstan. But we don't hear about that over here because they want us to think that the Soviet Union is an all-white country. And they therefore want to divide black people and people of color from the world socialist movement. But you see, what has been demonstrated by the existing socialist countries is that capitalism is not something which is eternal. Just like other social systems such as feudalism, capitalism is also mortal. Capitalism can also be condemned by the collective struggles of masses of people led by the working class to the ash pile of history. Capitalism is obsolete as a social system. It is obsolete, a system which is based on a small clique of capitalists controlling the majority of the wealth, exploiting the masses of people. Capitalism is a system which is obsolete because its own inventions, its own achievements, its own attainments can't even be put to socially useful purposes. Because right now in this country it is possible with the technology that has been developed under capitalism for every woman, man, and child to lead a decent, comfortable, productive, creative life. But that decent, comfortable, productive, creative life is not profitable for the capitalists. That is why we have to talk about smashing the capitalist system and instituting a socialist revolution. Because socialism means that no one is permitted to accumulate so much wealth that he or she can use it to exploit other human beings. But on the other hand, everyone receives the personal wealth that is necessary in order to ensure that he or she lives a comfortable life. Revolutions are always progressive. Today, if we talk about fundamental revolutionary social change, we have to talk about socialism. We have to talk about ushering in a socialist revolution. The capitalist classes here and in other countries have tried to perpetrate the idea that there is something that lies in between capitalism and socialism. Something that's not completely capitalism and something that's not completely socialism. And they have encouraged developing countries in Africa and Latin America to assume a so-called stance of neutrality, position of non-alignment. Like, remember when Mini decided that he was going to take a neutral position vis-a-vis Nixon's campaign? Well, that's what it's all about. U.S. imperialism is afraid that once the people of the world become aware of the real possibility of ushering in a socialist society, a socialist world, that they will hasten to embrace socialism. They will hasten to struggle for it, hasten to make a revolution. The trends of the world are clear, sisters and brothers. The direction of history is unmistakable. And the international expression of capitalism, namely imperialism, together with the capitalism which spawned it, will soon be assigned their rightful place in the burial grounds of history. Because across the globe, more and more people are indeed embracing socialism as the only real path to liberation, and they are joining in the international movement to dig the grave of capitalism. Africans are joining in, Asians, Latin Americans, Arabs, the working classes of the developed capitalist countries, and national liberation struggles within countries such as the United States. They are all moving ever more rapidly towards a conclusion that socialism is the answer. And I am convinced that if we are to begin to fulfill our human role in history, we in this country are going to have to join those millions throughout the world. And I think that all of you who are victims of capitalism in some way or another, black, brown, white, especially workers, students, professors, I think that you should very seriously consider the implications of this age of revolution we're living in. I am convinced that many of you will ultimately join the revolution, and that many of you will indeed have the opportunity to participate in the creation of a new society. You will build a society without racism, a society without poverty, a society without war. You will build indeed a society which is finally molded in the true image of human freedom.
This has been a Pacifica News recording of a speech by Angela Davis at the World Issues Conference at the University of Houston on April 2nd, 1973.
I want you to know that I am making no pretensions to impartiality. I am committed to the overthrow of what I see as the root cause of all of these evils. And I will continue to work for the overturning of the capitalist system here and throughout the world. I will continue to work alongside the millions all over the globe for the final triumph of socialism.